The grand cathedral bells tolled through the rain-washed city, each deep echo rolling across the gray horizon like a slow-beating drum announcing a ceremony the heavens themselves seemed to mourn. Inside the towering walls of St. Augustine's, rows of flickering candles cast trembling shadows across polished marble floors. At the far end of the aisle stood Adrian Vale, the youngest billionaire in the country, a man whose name alone could make investors tremble and tabloids spin for days. His face, strikingly handsome yet unreadable, remained carved in cold indifference as he watched the cathedral doors open. There she was, Elena Carter, wrapped in white silk that clung softly to her frame, her steps unsteady, her eyes carrying both fear and silent determination. To the world outside, this was a fairy tale union, beauty marrying power, innocence meeting wealth. But behind the shimmer of pearls and the scent of white roses lay a truth far from romance. This was not love. It was a bargain, an unspoken contract written in desperation. Elena's father, once a respected architect, had fallen ill months earlier, and with him had fallen everything they owned. Debt collectors circled like vultures, hospitals demanded payment, and hope had become a luxury she could no longer afford. When Adrian's lawyer appeared at her father's bedside with an offer to erase every debt to fund her father's treatment, to give him the care of the best doctors in the country, in exchange for her hand in marriage, Elena's heart shattered, yet she said yes. She told herself it was duty, not defeat. She told herself she could endure anything if it meant saving the man who had sacrificed everything for her. But as she stepped into the cathedral and felt hundreds of unfamiliar eyes on her, she realized no amount of courage could truly prepare her for what she was about to give away. The air was heavy with silence as she took her first step down the aisle, clutching a small bouquet of lilies. Every echo of her heels against the stone seemed to mark the end of another piece of her old life. Her childhood dreams of love, of laughter, of shared secrets under the stars crumbled with every step toward the man waiting ahead. Adrian stood still, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze unyielding. His eyes, gray as winter steel, betrayed neither anger nor warmth, only control. It was said that he could turn a company to dust with a single sentence, that he built his empire not on passion but on precision, calculation, and the art of never showing weakness. As she approached, he extended his hand, not to offer comfort but to complete a transaction. She placed her trembling fingers into his, and though his touch was warm, the gesture felt colder than the rain outside. The ceremony began. Words of eternal vows filled the air, spoken by a priest who sensed the weight of two souls standing side by side but oceans apart. Adrian's voice was calm, practiced, free of hesitation when he said, "I do." When her turn came, Elena felt her chest tighten. For a second, her mind screamed to run, to flee the cathedral, to take her father's hand and find another way. But then she saw her father's face flash in her mind, fragile, smiling weakly from the hospital bed, telling her she deserved happiness, even if he never lived to see it. Her lips trembled, but her voice did not break. "I do," she whispered. The moment the words left her mouth, something inside her fell silent forever. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian leaned forward and kissed her gently. It was neither cruel nor tender, simply a formality, the sealing of a promise made not with love but with obligation. Yet in that fleeting touch, Elena felt a confusing warmth like a spark caught in a storm. Before she could understand it, he had stepped away, offering her his arm and leading her down the aisle as the organ played a hymn that sounded more like a requiem. Outside, the rain had slowed, but the world still looked gray. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and the newlyweds stepped into a waiting limousine that glided away from the cathedral toward a future neither fully understood. The drive to Adrian's estate was long and silent. Elena sat by the window, her reflection blurred by raindrops, wondering if she had just saved her father's life or sold her own soul. Adrian sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. She wanted to ask him why he had chosen her, out of all the women who would have gladly married him for his wealth, his name, his world of glittering power. But the words would not come. There was a heaviness in the air, a wall between them built of pride and mystery. Finally, as the city lights faded and the countryside unfolded around them, Adrian spoke, his voice low and measured. "You don't need to be afraid," he said without looking at her. "This is not a cage, Elena, it's a beginning." "What kind, only time will decide." She turned toward him. startled by the unexpected softness in his tone. But before she could respond, the car pulled through iron gates taller than trees. Vale Manor stood like a monument to another era, grand, silent, and endless. The mansion's lights glowed faintly through the mist, casting long shadows across the rain-soaked driveway. Elena's breath caught at the sight. It was beautiful, yet it felt like stepping into another world, one where she did not belong. When the doors opened, they were greeted by Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, a woman whose kind smile was the first warmth Elena had felt that day. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vale," she said with genuine affection, as if the words themselves were a blessing. Elena smiled weakly, unsure how to respond. Adrian simply nodded and disappeared down the corridor, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. Mrs. Hawthorne led her up a sweeping staircase into a room that looked like something out of a dream. Soft cream walls, velvet drapes, and a balcony overlooking endless gardens. "This is your room," the woman said kindly. "Mr. Vale thought you might want your own space until you're settled." Elena nodded. Of course, it wasn't love, it was convenience. She changed into the silk nightgown laid across the bed and stared at the moon through the window. For the first time since saying her vows, she let the tears fall. They were silent, steady, and cleansing. She had made her choice. Now she would live with it. But as she lay there, the sound of footsteps paused outside her door. A shadow lingered for a moment, then faded away. Adrian had walked by, perhaps to check on her, perhaps by accident. Either way, he did not enter. Yet the gesture left a question burning quietly in her chest. If he was truly heartless, why did it feel like he was fighting something inside himself? Days passed in quiet rhythm. Adrian left early each morning for his offices, returning late in the evening. Elena filled her time painting, exploring the manor, and writing letters she never sent to her father. Mrs. Hawthorne became her friend, her only connection to warmth in the vast, cold estate. One evening, Elena wandered through the library, a breathtaking room filled with thousands of books, their spines glowing softly in golden light. There she found something unexpected, a painting half-finished, standing on an easel near the window. It was a portrait of a young woman, soft, graceful, alive. The brushwork was passionate, full of feeling. The signature in the corner made her gasp. It was Adrian's. Beneath the coldness, beneath the empire, there was an artist, a soul that once felt deeply enough to capture life in color. That night, when he returned, she found the courage to speak. "You paint," she said softly over dinner. Adrian looked up, surprised. "I used to," he replied after a pause. "A long time ago. Why did you stop?" she asked. His eyes darkened, and for a moment she saw a flicker of pain. "Because life taught me that beauty fades, and love is a luxury for the foolish." His words were sharp, but his voice broke slightly at the edges. Elena realized then that he was not cold by nature. He was wounded. Whatever had built his empire had cost him something far greater. And as she listened, she understood her own reason for being there was not just to save her father, but perhaps to remind this man that not all love ends in ruin. That night, as she sat on her balcony, she looked out over the moonlit gardens and made herself a promise. She would not let this marriage be a prison. She would not live as the girl who sold her heart for money. She would become something stronger, someone who could stand beside the most powerful man in the country and not feel small. She would teach herself to smile again, to paint again, to believe again, because no matter how cold his gaze was, she saw in his silence a spark he was afraid to acknowledge. And if fate had bound their lives together in a contract of necessity, perhaps time could rewrite it into something neither of them expected, something real. The soft hum of summer settled over Vale Manor like a gentle spell, wrapping the sprawling estate in a warmth that made even its silent corners feel alive. The gardens bloomed with color, the air carried the fragrance of jasmine and freshly cut grass, and the sound of laughter, Elena's laughter, began to echo faintly through the hallways where once there had been only quiet footsteps. Her presence had changed everything. The staff adored her, not for her title or beauty, but for the way she treated everyone with kindness and respect, as though she didn't belong to the world of the powerful, but to the world of the real. And for Adrian, the man whose heart had been locked behind years of emotional frost, that kindness had become an unfamiliar light that both comforted and frightened him. He would watch her sometimes from a distance, unable to explain why her laughter felt like sunlight seeping through the cracks of a long-forgotten room inside him. He had never intended to fall for her, never even believed himself capable of such vulnerability again. Yet every day she melted away another layer of the ice that had shielded his soul for so long. But love in Adrian's world was never simple. The higher he climbed, the darker the shadows that followed him. And as his feelings for Elena grew, so too did the ghosts of his past stir awake. One afternoon, while Adrian was away in the city attending meetings, Elena received an unexpected visit. A woman stepped out of a sleek black car at the edge of the drive. A woman with auburn hair, flawless skin, and eyes that carried the sharpness of someone who had learned to win in a ruthless world. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Cassandra Reed," she said, her tone smooth, confident, too polished to be friendly. Adrian's former business partner, and once something more. The word struck Elena like a slap she didn't see coming. Cassandra's gaze swept over her, elegant and appraising. "So it's true. He married you. The girl from the hospital story." Her lips curled faintly. "You must be very persuasive to convince a man like Adrian Vale to play the role of a savior. Or perhaps he just enjoys collecting broken things." Elena stood tall, refusing to let the venom seep beneath her skin. "You must not know him very well anymore," she said quietly. "He's not the man who collects, he's the man who rebuilds." Cassandra laughed, the sound sharp as glass. "Rebuilds? My dear, Adrian doesn't rebuild. He replaces. He replaced his father, his rivals, and when the novelty fades, he'll replace you too." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. When the car disappeared down the drive, Elena stood there for a long time, her chest heavy with confusion and fear. She wanted to dismiss the woman's words as spite, but a seed of doubt had already been planted. That night, when Adrian returned, she could not meet his eyes. He noticed immediately. Over dinner, the silence between them stretched taut. Finally, he set down his glass and asked, "What happened?" His tone was calm but edged with concern. "You're quiet." "Too quiet?" Elena hesitated, then told him about Cassandra's visit. For a moment, his expression hardened, the old mask of the ruthless billionaire flashing across his face. "She shouldn't have come here," he said evenly. But his voice carried anger beneath the surface. "Cassandra and I have history, yes, but it ended long before you. She never forgave me for choosing integrity over ambition." Elena frowned, confused. "Integrity?" He sighed, his gaze distant. "We built a company together years ago, one that could have changed the industry. But she wanted shortcuts, illegal ones. I refused. She lost her position, her influence. She's been waiting for revenge ever since." He met Elena's eyes then, and the steel in his voice softened. "Don't let her words poison what's real between us." Elena wanted to believe him, and yet, deep down, she feared what every woman fears when love begins to bloom, that it might not be returned, or worse, that it might not last. As days passed, that fear began to gnaw at her in subtle ways. She noticed things she hadn't before: the late-night calls, the sudden business trips, the tension in Adrian's shoulders when he thought she wasn't watching. One evening, she decided to confront him, not with accusation but with courage. "You don't have to keep me in the dark," she said softly as he entered his study. "I'm not fragile, Adrian. If something's wrong, I'd rather face it with you than pretend it isn't there." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, and then something inside him gave way. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "There's a man trying to destroy everything I've built," he confessed. "He's been leaking false documents, manipulating the media, turning investors against me. Cassandra's working with him. I didn't want you involved in this mess." Elena's heart ached at the weariness in his voice. "Then let me stand with you," she said. "You're not alone anymore." He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, Elena. In my world, the closer someone gets to me, the more danger they're in. I've already dragged you far enough into this storm." That night, long after he fell asleep in his study, Elena sat awake by the window, thinking. She realized that love was not about staying safe. It was about standing firm when everything else trembled. The next morning, she began helping quietly, reading financial reports, analyzing news leaks, searching for patterns. Her years of art had taught her to see details others missed, and it wasn't long before she discovered something. One of Adrian's board members, A man named Frederick Lang had been funneling information to a rival company under Cassandra's influence. When she presented her findings to Adrian, he looked at her with astonishment. "How did you—" She smiled faintly. "You look at numbers. I look at people." For the first time, pride flickered openly in his eyes. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "You've just saved my company, but victories rarely come without scars." A week later, a scandal broke. A fabricated story about Elena's marriage twisted by tabloids into cruel fiction. Headlines screamed that she had trapped Adrian for money, that their wedding had been a calculated move from a desperate woman. Paparazzi surrounded the gates, cameras flashed day and night, and strangers who had never met her spoke about her as if they owned her story. Adrian, furious, wanted to sue every outlet involved, but Elena stopped him. "You can't fight every lie, Adrian," she said quietly. "The only way to silence them is to live the truth so loudly that they can't ignore it." Her calm stunned him, and for the first time he understood what real strength looked like. Not the kind that built empires, but the kind that endured storms without breaking. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened in ways words could barely describe. They began spending evenings walking through the gardens together, talking about dreams, regrets, and the strange beauty of second chances. Adrian spoke of his mother's love for art, how she used to tell him that people who feel deeply always scare those who don't. Elena told him how she once painted the ocean to remind herself that life, no matter how stormy, always returns to calm. Somewhere in those shared moments, love stopped being something unspoken. It became the air they breathed. Yet even as warmth settled between them, fate waited patiently with its next test. One evening, just as twilight brushed the sky in gold, Adrian's assistant rushed into the manor with urgent news. The rival company had filed false fraud charges against Vale Enterprises, threatening not only Adrian's reputation, but everything he had ever built. He could lose his company, his legacy, everything. That night, as they stood together in his office, the weight of it all pressing down, Elena took his hand and said, "You built your empire on truth, Adrian. Don't let lies tear it apart. Let me help you fight this, not as your wife, but as your equal." He looked at her then with eyes that held the reflection of the man he used to be, the dreamer, the believer, the son who had once played piano in the dark. "You already are," he whispered. "You've been my equal since the day you walked down that aisle." As dawn broke over the hills, Adrian and Elena prepared for the battle ahead. Together they began gathering evidence, confronting the board and exposing the betrayal from within. And while the world outside continued to doubt their marriage, those within the walls of Vale Manor saw the truth. Two souls, once bound by circumstance, now bound by choice. For the first time in his life, Adrian Vale understood that love was not a weakness but a revolution, the only kind strong enough to rebuild even the most guarded of hearts. The following week unfolded with the rhythm of a life that did not yet feel like her own. Elena would rise early, long before the sun gilded the horizon, and wander the echoing corridors of Vale Manor where the scent of polished oak and roses lingered in the air. Every morning she would stand by the window of her balcony, watching mist coil across the gardens like soft breath, and wonder if the silence she lived in was the kind that healed or the kind that suffocated. Adrian remained a distant presence, always polite, never cruel but wrapped in a calm that made it impossible to tell what he truly felt. Their conversations at dinner were steady, civilized, and often centered around practical things, updates on her father's health, the charities she might support as Mrs. Vale, the upcoming events he would need her to attend. But beneath that surface of propriety lived something unspoken, a current of tension that neither of them dared to name. It was not hostility. It was something more delicate, like the stillness before a storm or the hesitation before trust. One evening, after another day of endless rain, Elna found herself in the grand music room. She had been exploring, guided by curiosity more than purpose, when she saw the piano near the tall windows, an antique Steinway, polished to perfection, but clearly untouched for years. Dust clung to its lid, a silent witness to abandonment. Without thinking, she sat down and ran her fingers across the keys. The soft hum of the notes filled the air, fragile yet alive. For the first time since her marriage, she felt something shift inside her, like sunlight finding its way through a forgotten crack. She began to play, a melody her mother used to hum when she was a child, a tune of patience and hope. She lost herself in it, her emotions spilling into every note, unaware that Adrian had entered the room. He stood in the doorway, still in his black suit from the office, rainwater glistening in his hair, watching her with an expression that was not cold for once but quietly astonished. When the last note faded, Elena turned, startled to find him there. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, his gaze fixed on the piano, not on her. "You play beautifully," he said at last, his voice low, almost reverent. "My mother taught me," Elena replied softly, unsure how to read his tone. "She said music can reach places words cannot." Adrian's eyes flickered with something unreadable, pain perhaps, or nostalgia. "She was right," he said, taking a step closer. "I used to play too. My father hated it. He said it was a waste of time, that feelings make a man weak." His words hung in the air like a confession, and Elena realized she had just been given a glimpse into a locked room of his past. For a moment, neither spoke. They stood there in the dim light, two people bound by circumstance, each carrying a story of broken things they never asked for. That night, as they dined together, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but alive with something fragile and new. Adrian asked her about her childhood, her dreams before all this, her art. She told him about her students at the community center, about how teaching them to paint gave her a sense of purpose, of belonging. He listened, really listened, and Elena saw the faintest warmth bloom behind his gray eyes. "You miss it," he said quietly. "Yes," she admitted, "but I'm learning that missing something doesn't mean it's gone. Sometimes it's just waiting for you to be ready to find it again." Adrian's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "You see the world differently than most people," he said. "Maybe that's why I needed you here." His tone was soft, but the meaning behind his words lingered in the air long after the meal ended. The next morning, she received a call from the hospital. Her father's condition had stabilized and he was responding to treatment. The doctors were optimistic and her heart filled with gratitude so fierce that tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned to Adrian, who was preparing to leave for a meeting, and whispered, "Thank you. You've given me something I can never repay." He looked at her then, not as the billionaire who had bought her hand, but as a man who understood the weight of sacrifice. "You've already repaid it," he said quietly. "You gave me your trust even when I didn't deserve it." It was the first time she saw him hesitate, as though he was afraid of his own sincerity. She watched him leave, the tall, stoic figure vanishing into the morning mist, and realized that somewhere within his fortress of pride and pain, something human had begun to stir. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion slowly changed its rhythm. The house that once echoed with silence began to fill with small sounds. Her laughter as Mrs. Hawthorne taught her how to tend the roses, the faint music of the piano in the evenings, the clink of shared cups of tea after dinner. Even Adrian's footsteps softened, his return from work marked not by distance but by quiet anticipation. Yet there were moments when darkness crept back into his eyes, when he withdrew into his study and shut the door for hours. One evening, Elena found him there, sitting in the half-light, staring at a photograph on his desk. It was of a woman, beautiful, poised, and smiling faintly. "She was your mother?" Elena asked gently. Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. "She died when I was 12. My father blamed her for everything that went wrong. I learned early that love doesn't protect you, it destroys you." His voice broke just slightly, and the wall he had built for years cracked enough for her to see the pain beneath. Elena stepped closer and whispered, "Love doesn't destroy, Adrian, people do. Love is what gives us the strength to survive them." For the first time since their wedding, he looked at her without his armor. His eyes, usually cold and distant, were now filled with something raw and uncertain. "You believe that?" he asked. "I have to," she said, her voice steady. "Because if I stop believing in love, I stop believing in life itself." He didn't reply, but his silence was no longer empty. It was full of reflection, of slow understanding. That night, when she went to her room, she found a small gift waiting on her table, a silver pendant in the shape of a brushstroke, and a note in his handwriting that simply said, "For the artist you're meant to be." It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The following weekend, Adrian invited her to accompany him to a charity gala, a glittering event filled with the city's most powerful families. Elena was nervous. She had never been part of that world, but when she walked into the ballroom on his arm, wearing a gown that shimmered like moonlight, every eye turned toward her, not because of her beauty, but because of the quiet grace she carried. Adrian watched her with pride he tried to hide, introducing her as his wife with a tone that carried no pretense, only respect. Yet as the night went on, Elena noticed whispers among the crowd, stories about how their marriage had begun, cruel speculation disguised as curiosity. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the pity in their smiles. When she excused herself to the balcony for air, she thought she was alone until she heard his voice behind her. "They don't matter," Adrian said firmly, stepping closer. "They think they know everything because they've never had to lose anything worth knowing. Let them talk." She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's not them I care about," she said softly. "It's you. Sometimes I can't tell if you married me to save my father or to save yourself from feeling." His breath caught, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then finally his voice came low and honest. "Maybe both." That admission broke something open. It was not a confession of love, not yet, but it was truth, and truth was rarer than affection in his world. From that night on, something changed. They began to spend time together, not out of duty but choice. He showed her the old greenhouse on the edge of the estate, where his mother had once grown rare orchids. Together they cleaned the glass, planted new flowers, and watched life take root again. Elena saw him smile genuinely for the first time. She realized then that beneath the millionaire's precision and power was a man who had once been capable of warmth, but had buried it under years of loss. And Adrian in turn saw in her not the girl he had rescued, but the woman who had quietly begun to rescue him. Late one night, as they walked through the gardens under a sky scattered with stars, Adrian stopped and said, "You've changed this place." Elena frowned gently. "What do you mean?" He looked around, his voice soft but full of conviction. "This house used to be silent. Now it breathes again." She smiled faintly, her heart full. "Maybe it was never the house that was silent, Adrian. Maybe it was you." He looked at her then, and for a moment the man known as the coldest billionaire in the country simply looked human. Haunted, hopeful, alive. Neither of them spoke after that. The silence between them was no longer a wall but a bridge, fragile and shimmering in the moonlight, waiting for one of them to take the first step across. The storm that followed came without mercy. The morning after the accusations broke, the headlines blazed like fire across every screen in the country. Adrian Vale, the genius billionaire, the unshakable titan of industry, was being accused of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. False documents had been leaked, doctored evidence had been planted, and anonymous insiders whispered stories that spread like a disease through the media. In a single day, the name that once commanded fear and respect became a target of mockery and suspicion. Reporters gathered at the gates of Vale Manor, their cameras flashing endlessly as helicopters circled overhead. Elena stood by the window, watching the chaos unfold with her hands trembling. The man she had come to love, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was now standing on the edge of ruin. But what struck her most was not his downfall, it was his silence. Adrian did not yell, did not rage, did not crumble. He simply stood in his study, staring out at the storm as though he had been waiting for it all his life. When she entered the room, he didn't turn. His voice was quiet but steady. "They want to destroy me, Elena, not just my company, my name, my legacy." She stepped closer, her heart aching at the sight of his exhaustion. "Then let them try," she said firmly. "You've spent your whole life building walls, Adrian. Maybe this is the moment you learn that strength isn't in what you protect, but in what you refuse to give up." He turned then, and for the first time in days, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something vulnerable, almost like fear. "I don't know if I can survive another loss," he whispered. She reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his tightly. "You won't have to," she said. "Not this time." Over the next few days, the world around them descended into madness. Investors withdrew their money, business partners cut ties, and board members began to question Adrian's leadership. The pressure was relentless. Every hour brought a new accusation, a new betrayal. Yet through it all, Elena stood by him, not as a symbol of loyalty for the cameras, but as the anchor holding him steady. She attended meetings, faced the journalists, and handled the hateful gossip with grace that left even his critics speechless. When reporters shouted cruel questions about her marriage, she smiled and said only, "Love doesn't need permission from the world to be real." Her calm became his courage. But in private, the nights were heavy. There were moments when she found him sitting alone, the light of the fireplace flickering across his face, his eyes hollow with fatigue. It was in those moments she realized that the world didn't just want to destroy his company. It wanted to remind him of his old belief, that love only ever leads to pain. One night, as thunder rolled through the sky, Adrian confessed a truth he had hidden even from himself. "When I met you," he said quietly, "I thought I was doing you a favor. Paying your father's debts, saving your family. It made me feel in control again, powerful, unbreakable. But somewhere along the way, you changed everything. You made me care about things I swore I'd buried, and now that they're trying to take everything away, all I can think about is losing you." Elena moved closer, the shadows of the fire dancing around them. "You can't lose what isn't yours to own, Adrian," she said softly. "Love isn't a transaction. It's a choice. And I choose to stay. Not because I owe you, but because I believe in you." He looked at her for a long moment, and the wall that had once defined him finally cracked. He pulled her into his arms, not as the man who ruled empires, but as the man who had finally found home. But fate, cruel and unpredictable, was not done testing them. 2 nights later, Elena received an anonymous message, an invitation to a private meeting from a journalist claiming to have evidence that could clear Adrian's name. Against her better judgment, she went. The meeting took place in an old cafe on the edge of the city, long after midnight. The journalist, a quiet man with weary eyes, slid a folder across the table. "This," he said, "proves who framed him. But you have to be careful. The people behind this have power far beyond what you imagine." She opened the folder and froze. Inside were photographs, financial records, and correspondence, all pointing to one man, Frederick Lang, Adrian's trusted board member, and Cassandra Reed's silent partner. Her heart raced. This was the proof they needed. But before she could leave, the journalist's expression changed. "There's more," he said. "Lang isn't working alone. Someone inside Vale Enterprises gave him access to confidential files. Someone very close." Elena's breath caught. "Who?" The man hesitated. "A woman named Lydia Harrow, Adrian's assistant." The truth struck her like lightning. Lydia, the woman who had worked with Adrian for years, who had earned his trust, who had quietly orchestrated his meetings, schedules, and files. The betrayal cut deep. She thanked the journalist, took the folder, and drove home through the storm with her heart pounding. But when she arrived, the gates were surrounded by police cars. Panic seized her chest. She ran inside and found Adrian standing in the foyer, surrounded by officers. They were arresting him. Someone had anonymously submitted new evidence tying him to fraudulent transfers. Lydia was nowhere to be found. Adrian didn't resist. He looked at Elena, calm but resigned, and said, "Don't fight this. They'll come for you next." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I will never let them destroy you." As he was led away, his eyes met hers, and in that single look, an entire lifetime of love and regret passed between them. The days that followed were the hardest of her life. The world turned its back on them. The media called her delusional, blind, foolish. But Elena refused to give up. She spent every waking hour gathering evidence, reaching out to contacts and trying to locate Lydia. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. Every morning she visited Adrian in the detention center, bringing him hope even when he told her to stop. "You don't owe me this fight," he said one afternoon through the glass. "You've already given me everything I didn't deserve." She smiled through her exhaustion. "You once said love destroys people, Adrian. Let's prove it doesn't." Her chance came when she traced Lydia's digital footprint to a luxury apartment in the city. She went there alone, carrying the folder the journalist had given her. When Lydia opened the door, surprise flashed across her face. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "You don't understand what you're walking into." But Elena didn't flinch. "I understand betrayal," she said quietly. "And I understand fear. But what I don't understand is how someone can destroy the man who trusted them most." For a moment, guilt flickered in Lydia's eyes. Then she sighed. "You think this was about money?" "It wasn't. Cassandra wanted revenge. I wanted freedom. Working for Adrian was like living in someone else's shadow. Every day watching a man who never breaks, never bleeds. I wanted to see him fall. Elena stepped closer, her voice trembling but strong. Then you've seen him fall, and you've seen me rise. I won't let your bitterness destroy what's good in this world. Those words hit something deep inside Lydia. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps admiration, perhaps both. But in that moment, she broke. She confessed everything, signed a statement, and gave Elena the hard drives that proved Adrian's innocence. The next morning, Elena walked into the courthouse with her head held high and handed the evidence to the judge. Within hours, the charges were dropped. When Adrian walked free, the sun had just begun to rise. Elena was waiting at the steps, her hands clasped together, her eyes shining with tears. He approached her slowly, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "You did it," he whispered. She smiled softly. "No, we did." He took her hands, and for the first time in his life, Adrian Vale didn't care who was watching. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though letting go would mean losing the only truth he had ever known. Around them, cameras clicked, reporters shouted, but the noise faded into nothing. All that mattered was that in a world built on lies and power, love, quiet, steady, unbreakable love, had won. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, they sat together in the garden. The world was still watching, still judging, but inside the walls of Vale Manor there was peace. Adrian turned to her, his voice low and full of awe. "You saved me," he said. Elena shook her head gently. "No, you saved yourself. I just reminded you what you were fighting for." He smiled then, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "When I first saw you walk down that aisle, I thought I was buying a solution. I never imagined I was meeting the reason I'd learned to live again." And as night fell around them, the once cold billionaire and the woman who had defied an empire sat beneath the stars, their hands entwined, not as husband and wife bound by circumstance, but as two souls who had survived the fire and come out whole. The days that followed Adrian's release unfolded with a strange and sacred calm, as though the universe itself had decided to pause and watch what these two souls would do with their second chance. The news channels that once screamed with accusation now buzzed with reluctant admiration, and even the harshest tabloids began to soften their tone. "Vale redeemed," the headlines read, and beneath them a photograph of Adrian and Elena walking hand in hand down the courthouse steps, their faces calm, their eyes steady, as if they had both looked into the heart of ruin and learned not to fear it anymore. Yet for all the noise outside, within the walls of Vale Manor there was only silence, peaceful, gentle silence, like the breath of a home that had finally learned how to heal. In the first days, Adrian barely spoke of what had happened. He moved through the house quietly, often standing for long moments by the windows or walking alone through the gardens where the scars of old storms still showed on the stones. He was not the same man who once lived behind walls of control and ambition. The arrogance had melted away, leaving behind a depth that words could not describe. When Elena found him like that, lost in thought, she never interrupted. She simply walked beside him, her presence speaking more than comfort ever could. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset over the hills, he finally broke the silence. "I used to think success was the only way to protect myself," he said, his voice low, reflective, "that if I was powerful enough, no one could ever hurt me again. But power doesn't make you safe, it makes you lonely. It was you who taught me that." Elena turned toward him, the fading sunlight painting gold across her face. "Then maybe everything that happened wasn't to break you, Adrian," she said softly. "Maybe it was to rebuild you into who you were always meant to be." Over time, the world began to change its story. Investors returned, the company stabilized, and those who had once abandoned him now sought his forgiveness. But Adrian, wiser now, did not seek revenge or validation. He simply rebuilt his company on new foundations: honesty, compassion, and purpose. He restructured his empire to give opportunities to young entrepreneurs who, like Elena once had, came from places where dreams were often dismissed as foolish. He opened new charities in his mother's name and launched art scholarships in Elena's honor, believing that creativity was not a luxury, but the soul of human progress. The same newspapers that once called him ruthless now called him visionary. Yet none of it mattered to him as much as the quiet life he returned to every night. The sound of Elena's laughter echoing through the manor, the scent of paint and roses drifting through the halls, the steady rhythm of peace that had finally taken root in his heart. One night, as autumn returned and the air grew cool again, Adrian invited Elena to join him on the terrace. The stars hung above them like jewels scattered across an endless sky, and the soft glow of lanterns painted the garden in warm gold. He poured her a cup of tea and sat beside her, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "There's something I've never told you," he began, his tone quiet but weighted with emotion. "About my father." Elena listened silently, sensing that this was a truth he had carried for years. "He was brilliant," Adrian continued, "but he believed that weakness was unforgivable. When my mother died, he blamed her love for making him vulnerable. He told me that caring for anyone would only destroy me. I spent my whole life proving him right, until you." He turned to her, his eyes glimmering under the light. "You didn't just teach me how to love, Elena. You taught me that vulnerability isn't a weakness. It's the only way to truly live." She reached out and took his hand. "Then let her memory see what her love created through you," she said softly. "Because every act of kindness you give now, every life you touch, that's her legacy too." In the weeks that followed, Adrian began restoring the old west wing of Vale Manor, the one his mother had once filled with her art. Elena helped him transform it into a community arts center, a place where children from across the city could learn, create, and dream without limits. When the project was completed, they held a small opening ceremony. The hall was filled with paintings, music, and laughter, and as the children ran through the corridors with paint on their hands and joy in their eyes, Elena felt tears of gratitude fill hers. Adrian stood beside her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "You did this," he murmured. She shook her head with a smile. "We did this. Together." He paused, then whispered, "I never thought I'd find peace in this house, but you made it a home." Months passed, and their love deepened not through grand gestures but through quiet consistency, the way he would pause his meetings just to have tea with her, the way she would wait up when he worked late, leaving a light on so he never came home to darkness. Every day became a small promise kept, yet the true measure of their bond revealed itself one winter evening, when Elena received devastating news. Her father's condition, which had stabilized for months, had worsened suddenly. Adrian arranged a private medical transport immediately, sparing no expense to bring him to the city's top hospital. For days, Elena barely slept, sitting at her father's bedside, her heart heavy with both fear and acceptance. Adrian stayed by her side through it all, holding her hand, handling the doctors, making sure she ate, saying nothing but never leaving. When her father finally passed away, peacefully and without pain, she collapsed into Adrian's arms. He held her through the night, saying nothing, because he knew that grief was not something to be fixed. It was something to be carried together. In the months that followed, Elena poured her pain into her art. She painted memories of her father, their old home, the moments of kindness that had shaped her soul. Each canvas became a piece of healing, and when she finally held her first public exhibition, it was Adrian who insisted she sign every painting with her full name, Elena Vale. "You earned this life," he told her. "You didn't marry into it, you built it." The exhibition became a quiet success, drawing people not because of her title, but because of the raw emotion her work carried. One critic wrote, "Her art feels like forgiveness painted into form." And perhaps in many ways that was true. Years later, the world came to know their story not as the tale of a cold millionaire and the woman he bought, but as the journey of two broken souls who rebuilt each other piece by piece. Adrian was no longer called the Ice King. People spoke of him as the man who proved that love could humanize power. Elena became known not only as his wife but as an artist whose work inspired thousands to believe that beauty can rise even from pain. They never forgot what they had endured, the betrayals, the loneliness, the storms, but they also never let those shadows define them again. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Adrian arranged a quiet ceremony in the same cathedral where it had all begun. This time the pews were full, not with strangers but with friends, employees, and children from their foundation. As Elena walked down the aisle again, the same bells rang, but the meaning was entirely different. She walked not out of obligation but out of love, and when she reached him, Adrian took her hands and whispered, "The first time you walked to me, I saw a woman who would change my life. I just didn't know how completely. I thought I was rescuing you, but it was you who rescued me." Tears glimmered in Elena's eyes as she replied, "We rescued each other, Adrian. And that's what love truly is, a promise to walk through the storms, not away from them." As the music swelled and the guests rose in applause, they kissed, gently, tenderly, like two souls who had found their peace at last. Outside, the sky was clear, the sun breaking through soft clouds, bathing the cathedral steps in gold. And somewhere, beyond the reach of time and pain, the universe smiled at the two people who had dared to turn a transaction into destiny, a contract into a covenant, and a cold beginning into a love that would be remembered not for its wealth or power, but for its courage to heal. Because in the end, it was never about the money, the mansion, or the empire. It was about a man who learned to feel, and a woman who taught the world that strength doesn't come from perfection. It comes from endurance, compassion, and the refusal to give up on what's good. And as they stood together beneath that golden light, hand in hand, hearts unguarded, the story of Adrian and Elena Vale became more than a tale of love. It became a testament to every heart that has ever been broken, that no matter how cold the world may seem, warmth can always return if you dare to open your heart again.